Stefan, hello. Thank you for your patience. You've been amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Good morning, everyone. Hello, my name's James Harding. I'm an editor and a co-founder here at Tortoise, and a hearty welcome to you. It shows the quality of the people that you are, that you got up quite so early to try to wrestle not just Unilever, but global capitalism to the ground.
Oh, that's a nice intro. Thanks, James.
At breakfast time, exactly. Well, listen, we're delighted to have Alan Jope, the Chief Executive of Unilever, here. I just wanted to, for those of you who've not been here into our newsroom at Tortoise before, just to tell you a little about what we're trying to do. We started out, went live in April, so we're relatively new, but our ambition really is to try to do news in a different way. I think we're all aware of how fast the world of news is moving, how we all struggle with our own headline addictions. But what we're trying to do here is to see not how best to report the breaking news, but to try and understand what's driving it. And for that reason, to be a slow newsroom, we're focused on these big 5 themes that we think are changing the way we live: technology, our planet, the 100-year life, wealth, and belonging. And as well as just looking at the news from a different perspective, we have, we hope, a different approach to discussing it. So newsrooms typically obsess about storytelling, the best way to communicate a story. We're trying to fetishize the issue of listening. How best do we try and gather as much information as possible? And so the format that we operate in is called a ThinkIn. And the idea is that we're essentially modeled on a daily news conference. But instead of having just a room full of journalists discussing what's happening in the world, we have a wide and varied room that has a range of experience. And the reason that I say this, and I hope I'm catching you by the eye, is that this thing really only works if you weigh in. The ideal is that we hear from as many people as possible with as wide and different points of view as possible. And so we have only one, not particularly muscularly enforced rule. And our one rule is no questions. And the reason for that is that, frankly, we've all been to plenty of panel discussions where questions are actually points of view anyway. And we'd rather hear those things direct and unfiltered. So please do weigh in right from the top on what you think. Bring your expertise, your personal experience to bear. And the third and final thing that we're trying to do that's different is to try to make sure that we take an active interest in what happens next. Historically, newsrooms say, look, we'll report the story and go and leave the world to figure it out. Actually, we're really interested in making the connections, understanding the networks that can make a difference to the things that we think are important, that we think, thanks to our members, are important. So we hope that in that spirit, you'll engage not just today, but in an ongoing way with what we're doing. 2 very small things that you should know. One is that there are microphones and cameras, so if you're about to say something rude or extremely indiscreet, go ahead, but just be aware that you're going to be filmed. And the other thing is that life, and indeed this thinking, is a race against time. And you'll see there is Agatha, our tortoise. She makes her way across the screen, and once she's done, our time is up. So don't hold back. Weigh in from the top. This morning, I should say something. I'm a business journalist who really wants to be a religion correspondent, and I suppose we've kind of covered it all this week, because we started the week with Richard Dawkins sitting here, and we're ending it with Alan. And so I suppose there's a reason why I ended up not getting the Richard Dawkins gig, but getting Alan. And I suppose the reason is this. I think there have been only 2 really great business stories this year. One was WeWork, and the other was Why We Work. And the Why We Work story, the idea that some of the most prominent business people in the world have come out and said that we are changing the motivating thought of business, that purpose, that our responsibility to stakeholders counts in the way that our responsibility to shareholders counts, is potentially a seismic change in the way in which business works, or just a handy piece of PR. And so I just wanted to start with the room's, if you like, skeptometer. How many people who think that the discovery of purpose is a pivotal moment in the way in which capitalist enterprises and large businesses will work? How much do you think it is a pivotal moment for the good? Oh, interesting. That's a relief. And how many people think it's not? How many people think this is a kind of rebranding or redressing, essentially, of the same old deal? Oh, okay. So I will brand you 68% optimists, and the remainder realists.
Well, yeah.
Okay. So
it should be spicy.
It should be spicy. So, Alan, why don't we start with this? So I think we get a sense of what we're talking about. What is purpose?
James, first of all, congratulations on what you've achieved with Tortoise. We personally, and as a company, we think the effort to get a thoughtful point of view into the news, to cover stories properly, to give time for the story to emerge is just such a healthy and necessary thing in society. So I know you've stuck your neck out your shell to get this one going, and power to your elbow, mate. I hope it goes brilliantly.
Thank you very much.
We intend to be supporters.
Thank you very much.
What is purpose? I think it's pretty straightforward. Up for the last 100 years or so, brands have got by on trying to persuade us that it was important to have our shirts washed whiter, our skin be softer and smoother, our food a little tastier, and have brands have built themselves on standing for functional and emotional benefits. We believe that after a century of marketing running that way and brands running that way, that's no longer enough. That brands have to take a position on matters that are a little more important than that. And our definition of purpose is simply whether our brands and our company can be clear about how we leave society or the planet a little better than where we're not around.
Okay. And can we just do two things there? Firstly, it's quite a big change to go from saying the company has to have a purpose to saying the brands have to have a purpose. Why does each brand have to have a purpose? And is there not a risk in that you end up doing some things that are sort of slightly eccentric or creepy in order to try and land a purpose for a specific brand?
Yes. Well, I think it's different for different companies. So if you're a mono-brand company where the company name is the brand name, Apple, then this is a non-issue. Mm-hmm. But if you're a multi-brand company like Unilever, there are certain things we need to do at a corporate level and have been doing around all kinds of different positive things that we're doing. But at the end of the day, that becomes corporate social responsibility unless it has the ability to drive better performance in the business. And ultimately, nobody buys Unilever other than investors, and they're our last stakeholder we concern ourselves with. Throwing you a bone that you can pick that up.
I'll go for that. Just give us the hierarchy.
Yeah, so it begins with consumers, the people we serve, our customers, our employees, society, the planet, and the shareholders. And we believe that's a sequential list of priorities. And if we serve those groups in that order, then shareholders will be well rewarded, superiorly rewarded as a byproduct. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's come to that in one second.
I didn't really answer your question. Let me just say one thing.
Yeah.
So it's nice that we do things as a corporation, but ultimately people choose brands, not companies. Most people choose brands, not companies. And so our point of view around societal and environmental impact has to show up on our brands. And we have some very good examples of that, but much of our portfolio is not clear on that yet. And then to the very interesting question you asked, we're not forcing the pace at which our brands have to adopt or find their purpose, because if you do, you end up with fake purposes, and you said creepy ones, but yeah, inappropriate ones. So it has to be a somewhat organic process of discovery, that what really fits. You know, Dove's famous for its campaign for real beauty and trying to do some work to help girls' self-esteem. That's taken 15 years to land in the public consciousness. That's how long it takes.
So, and what's the line of what you won't do? I mean, it's one thing to say, look, we want to address the planet, we want to address the climate crisis, but what about an issue like immigration?
Yeah.
What about an issue we talked about before in the US, like gun control? What are the things that you say, look, these are just not issues that a company can healthily or sensibly engage with?
I'd like to introduce the concept here of brand say and brand do. So brand say is, call it advertising, messaging, what you talk about. But behind all that, there should be an activity system that supports and brings authenticity to what you're trying to do. So, for example, the only reason why our brand Lifebuoy, which is an antibacterial soap, can talk about saving the lives of kids under the age of 5 is because we've now worked with about 1 billion people one-to-one on teaching proper hand washing that eliminates preventable disease. The only reason why Domestos can talk about trying to end the degradation of open defecation is because we've helped put 16 million toilets into homes in India. Mm-hmm. And I profoundly believe that brands have to be doing positive things before you start talking about them. So that's one lens on well, you shouldn't be talking about things that you're not having an authentic, positive impact on. That's point one.
Yep.
And then there are some issues that brands may choose to steer away from. We don't think there's very many of those. So as it happens, we don't have a brand that's championing gun control, but I wish we did. But we're not going to take that on just because it's an interesting issue. It has to relate to the purpose of one of our brands.
But Alan, isn't the risk that you end up with this rather odd patchwork of purposes that suit the categories that you're in, but are not necessarily trained on the big problems we face?
Yeah, well, there really are only 2 big problems that we face. Doesn't feel like that most mornings when you read the papers, but climate change and inequality are the root causes of most of the big issues. And one way or another, just about every one of our brands' activity systems ladder up to one of those 2 problems. And we have a hierarchy of issues, but they all end up on climate change and inequality.
Who would like to weigh in at this stage just on the question of what a company's purpose can or can't be, what the limits of purpose might be? Yes. Will you just say your name?
Marine.
Marine.
The question is how...
No, oops. Oh. my point of view is...
Hang on, we're starting all over again. I'm going to give the introductory spiel and the whole thing, yeah.
My view, it all starts with different decision making. And I believe the ultimate decision making in our capitalist world is money. So I'm actually looking at how can we change this different way to make decisions so that purposeful action are valued,
Yeah.
not by just the consumer, but also the customer, also the shareholders. And
Marine, forgive me if I'm leading the witness, but do you think that the incentives in business, the financial incentives, are aligned with these purposes, or do you think that
That sounded
making money
awfully
is a
like a
separate...
question, James.
Yeah, I'm allowed to. I make these rules up.
Oh, okay, you made the rules.
So I believe today they might not be all the time, and it's starting to be sometimes. But there should be a way to accelerate the impact on climate change or inequality throughout all those great initiatives by having a stronger objective and pushing this decision making.
All right. Any other views on... Sir?
Yes, Sam. So I think that if the impact that you've talked about isn't measured, then I think it does fall afoul of the sort of marketing greenwash. And so, for instance, I think saying that Lifebuoy and hand washing is a good thing. I think it sounds good, but I think you've got to then obviously evidence that actually reduces disease.
Yeah.
If you don't, then I think it could be accused of being greenwash.
And Sam, what do you think about this question of the limits of purpose? I.e., are there things that you actively would not like companies to be engaging in? I mean, like national security, or that you think we just don't think that this is a company's purpose at all.
Yeah, because I think, for any particular organisation, you will have many negative externalities. You've got to pull those out and limit those, and those things fall under that.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yes, I just think there's a risk that we're assuming that companies can help fix a whole swathe of problems. I just want to get a sense of what the room thinks. So I'm going to come to you. I'll come to you in what's your name?
Josh.
Josh.
I just wonder, there's a danger of kind of trying to make generalised conclusions about all companies and all products and all brands. Domestos, Lifebuoy, some of your other brands, they kind of naturally fit with addressing certain social issues. If you're selling baked beans or jumpers or toothbrushes is a bad example. There are other product types.
Oh, I'm dying to disagree with you.
Yeah.
Great. But I wondered if you think all product types lend themselves to a purpose.
All right.
Sorry,
I think it was rhetorical. I think it was a beautiful guy. So can I just ask the room a question? Who here, when they hear this as a purpose, thinks that this is a credible mission for a company? Starbucks, to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighbourhood at a time. Who here thinks that's credible? Love you. Who here thinks that's not, 1.5 people? Who here thinks that's not particularly credible as a mission? Okay, and can I ask you a different question? Who here thinks this, Lego, and inspire and develop the builders of tomorrow? Do you think that's what Lego does?
Yes.
Do you? God, you're lovely people. Okay, Alan, can we go back to Maureen's thing just to start with, right? Because I guess where I'm most sceptical about purpose, right, is that it looks to me as though the entire infrastructure of business has effectively been built in the 19th century, that the system of auditing, the Companies Act, remuneration for executives, incentives, the whole system is essentially financially geared, and it's backward-looking.
Yeah.
And the whole pitch of purpose is to be forward-looking and to be focused on social outcomes. So there seems to me to be a structural mismatch here.
Let me link Sam's point and Marina's point. So Sam, I couldn't agree more. If you don't measure it, it's nonsense. And so I could bore you to death about the auditing, the third-party verification, matched control sets of similar villages in India, somewhere hand washing and looking at infant mortality. So at all points, unless you get what you inspect, you don't get what you expect. And so I couldn't agree more. And then the question, trying to build a slightly artificial bridge. If you believe that purpose and profit are fundamentally opposed, I think you'll never reconcile it. Our belief system is the opposite. Our belief system is that we will be a more successful business by standing for things that matter in the world, and at lots of levels. We know it drives consumer preference. We know it drives customer preference. Tesco want to partner with companies that are helping them collect plastic. We know it drives innovation. If you have to, I don't think anyone in this room has to carry their water for a kilometre to wash your clothes or prepare meals or your family. If you have to carry your water a kilometre and it's heavy stuff water, then a laundry detergent that rinses away with one wash instead of 3 rinses, that's a very meaningful innovation. It also takes out cost surprise. So sometimes when you move to sustainable sourcing, there's an initial cost hump. So right now, recycled plastic resin is more expensive than virgin resin, as perverse as that seems. But we're 100% convinced that once we build the infrastructure, it makes sense. The cost of second-hand plastic will be cheaper than the cost of new plastic. We've taken 600 million euros of cost out of our operations by moving to green electricity and reducing our electricity consumption. So consumer, customer, innovation, cost, and most of all, we have an entire generation of team members at Unilever who have joined because of the values and the purpose of the company. And it has been a transformative impact on our ability to attract the best talent. And I think as a result, the shareholder will be better rewarded.
Okay.
But if you believe they're in opposition, you...
No, but I don't. But hold on. There's a difference between them being in opposition and actually thinking that the requirements on you financially constrain what you can do in terms of innovation, investment, and purpose. So, you know, if you read the financial pages, they will say, look, the requirement on Unilever is to be hitting a sales growth number of between 3 and 4%.
Right.
They're measuring your share price growth against Nestle, and they're going to keep an eye on that. And if they don't like it, they're going to move from one stock to another. And so it's not to say they're fundamentally opposed, Alan, but there is clearly an extent to which the dividend requirement, the shareholder improvement requirement, constrains the investment that you can make on purpose.
So let me say something really heretical. I'm still very new in the job, and one of the first things that I wanted to do was go out and kind of do a intensive listening tour. And I did go, and I had not that much experience with our investors, and I'd heard a lot. So I went and spoke to our investors, and most of you will know there's a difference between sell-side analysts who write reports for a living. Writing is a noble profession. And fund managers who actually make the choice on where to put the money. The big surprise for me was those fund managers were all saying, Alan, run the business for the long term. In fact, if anything, they're saying, take a profit reset if you need to reinvest in the business. And so we've taken lots of steps to try to move Unilever to a long-term model of capitalism, not a short-term model of capitalism. And that's not the we're like a...
But can I just ask you, is that an elephant trap? If you did that, would that make your credibility in the marketplace, would it damage your credibility in the marketplace? Would it be much more difficult to operate?
Speaking candidly, I think it would now, because I came in and very early on, as chief exec said, we don't need to do that.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
But if I then went back and said, "Oops, didn't get that right," I think it would.
But hold on a second. Isn't that always the problem, Alan? Is that we've created, particularly in the listed world, in publicly listed companies, an expectation of very steady sales growth and absolutely rock solid delivery of dividends. So if you think that you need to fundamentally re-engineer a large part of the way in which we eat, for example, or the food chain, and that's going to be a 5-year revolution, you can't press pause in your delivery to investors.
You absolutely can. So first of all, I don't think Unilever needs to. I think we can be a positive force for good without having to do that. But use the example of Adobe. So Adobe, Shantanu Narayan, who runs Adobe, came in as chief exec, and they were in the business of selling boxes with a CD in it, right? And on the CD would be Acrobat, Photoshop, something like that. And he said, I don't believe that's the right model, because what happens is every year we have a new release, and automatically when we release the new stuff, the old customers, our valued customers, are being cheated in a way. So he said, I want to move Adobe to a subscription model. So you subscribe to Adobe now, and as part of that subscription, every time they innovate and improve the product, everyone benefits. And the problem was moving from that model, from a one-time payment model to a subscription model, necessitated a dip in their top-line delivery. He went to the market, he went to the financial markets and said, this is what we're going to do, explained the logic, and you know what? The Adobe share price did not dip one bit. So sale, top and bottom line dipped, but there was a vision at the end of it. He's built it back, and look at the performance of the business since then. To me, that is the role model. Now, there's a different question. So I really don't agree that capitalism is a constraint on doing the right thing in our business. I think doing the right thing will drive better top and bottom line performance. There's an even bigger question, which I don't know how to answer, which is perpetual growth sustainable in the world?
Yeah.
That I don't know the answer to, and I think that'd be an interesting one to maybe hear some.
All right, thoughts? Which one you come? I'll come to you soon.
So yeah, Bruce, I run a crowdfunding company now, but I used to be a brand consultant, and I've worked on a lot of Unilever brands. My first job was writing the innovation guide for Unilever. And so I just wanted to make a point around, when we talk about brands, so I don't think anyone believes that Starbucks vision apart from the people who work for Starbucks, because what you're reading there is their strategy, not their brand. You know, when you work with Purcell, you buy dirty is good, but there's a strategy behind that came up with that idea. So don't confuse. I think, you know, companies are complex organisations, and what you're trying to do with a brand is to create internal change, whereas before the brand was only an external thing. Now it's an internal driver of your behaviour. So what we're talking about here is not so much about capitalism changing, but just the way that you're more aware, you're making employees aware that people are watching them, and then you're asking employees to make moral decisions, and that's the difference. I thought there was when Dave Lewis talked about it, he said, you know, things that, look, if the customer knew you were doing it, would they be happy?
Yeah.
So those sort of, that's really what we're talking about with purpose. It's not necessarily big things like taking on a political thing such as gun control. It's as a company, are you acting morally? And within companies which are bureaucratic organisations, and Unilever particularly so, that there's sometimes an excuse for doing something, and you take away the excuse when you have purpose.
Yeah.
So, come to you.
Three things. Number one,
Will you just introduce yourself?
Craig Cohan, 15 years with the Coca-Cola Company, and then 10 years in plastic recycling and in that space now. Number one, I think that capitalism is a force for good. I think we have to redefine growth completely. So we have to need a new lexicon of what growth is and what success is. Number two, I think within capitalism, I would love for your company to become a private, family-owned company. Because the difference is that the public markets, private equity, and venture capital, we won't make the change we need to. And in the family-run businesses, if you were to buy it back with all your young employees owning that company, you would be able to create so much innovation and have radical transformation. So, please.
Hold on, Craig. Can I just ask you, hold on a second. But that is a lovely, but it seems to me fond idea.
Yes.
In that there's not a family that can just step in and say we'll buy Unilever. So the options.
The definition of family and I think we.
So you mean you
financial structure.
Could be a family of employees.
The family of employees.
Yeah. Absolutely, a family of employees.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I love the idea of mutualisation. Yes.
Hi, Rebecca Jones, journalist and founder of a company called New Money. I think the
Your hand was the first to go up. Who are the skeptics?
Yeah, I'm on that camp. So I think the problem with this conversation around purpose and profit or capitalism is that companies are allowed to define what that means themselves. So companies are allowed to define what purpose means. Companies are allowed to define what sustainability means, and Unilever obviously was the leader in that. In 2010, you guys basically captured the entire market on sustainability. So, you know, when you say that your products are sustainable, that's because you're writing the rules. So that's the difference between companies and governments. So unfortunately, as the notes point out, the trust in governments is at an all-time low, in fact even below trust in companies. But really, it's the government's job to be doing a lot of the things, it's, you know, global government or local government's job to be doing a lot of the things we're now expecting companies to do.
Yeah.
So we're asking companies whose principal motivation is profit to do things that government should really be doing, and they're allowed to write their own rules. So I think that's the fundamental problem.
All right. So sorry, let's give this gentleman at the back, and then I'll come to you guys in a bit. Yeah.
Pete Simmons. I'm very open-minded about the role companies can play. I don't necessarily see that there has to be this narrow distinction between what governments do and what companies do. But what I do think is that companies don't today, you've made some really strong assertions. You said climate change and inequality are the root causes of most big issues. That's your perspective, and it may be your company's perspective too, but it is just a perspective. So I think companies have to get into the business. If this is the way we're going, and I'm happy for it to be, you have to explain where your legitimacy comes from in the way that politics does. And I want to know where the mandate comes from. Because activity systems is all very well, and measuring it is vital. But do your employees universally agree with this, partially agree with this? Do your customers? Does the public? And I think that matters.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Peter Sigrist, yeah.
So Peter, so when we started this debate actually at the beginning of the year, and one of the people came in quoting Milton Friedman, right? And the point that they were trying to make about Milton Friedman's assertion about the purpose of business being the reward of shareholders was not that it was just sort of red in tooth and claw capitalist, but that the fact is chief executives are not elected, they're not accountable to the public, there's not a democratic process or mandate, and I'm not sure that people necessarily want that. So when you say what the sort of foundational legitimacy is, what could that be? Because I don't think we want to move to a world, or conceive of a world in which chief executives of businesses are answerable, if you like, to the electorate.
Well, at risk of opening another can of worms, we're being asked to look a lot at the moment about where democratic legitimacy comes from in our political system in the UK. And I don't think it's true to say we all have a vote on what path we're going to take next as a country. So I don't actually think it's fair, again, to say there's this clear distinction between political legitimacy and corporate legitimacy. There are different systems of democracy, and I think there's room for them all.
Sir, yes.
I think we have to re-earn our legitimacy every single day, particularly in fast-moving consumer products, where there's an alternative brand in each and every single business that we're in. Every day we have to re-earn the trust and preference of shoppers. Every day we have to re-earn the trust and legitimacy with our employees. Every single Unilever employee could leave tomorrow for more money. I guarantee it. And we have to re-earn legitimacy every day with our investors and various other stakeholders. So I feel enormous responsibility and pressure to prove that we are the type of business that people want to buy from, that people want to work for, and that people want to invest in, day out.
But Alan, there's a difference. That legitimacy comes in two forms, doesn't it? There's a legitimacy that comes from trust in your products. I buy it, they're good, they work, they're good value. And then trust in you, your organisation, your people on purpose. And can I just pick up on Rebecca's point? Let's talk a bit about the environment and beyond sustainability.
Yep.
Because I think part of the question that people have, even those who are enthusiastic, even those who are in the majority of the room that say something is changing here, I think many would worry that even if companies like yours move, they just can't move fast enough. And that leaving this up to sort of enlightened executives is just not sufficient.
I agree.
Okay, so what do we do?
I agree, and I think it comes back to measurement. The fact that reports and accounts are basically a P&L, a balance sheet, and a cash flow statement isn't good enough. And there are multiple schemes up and running right now to try and measure the social and environmental impact of companies. And one of the most helpful thing that government could do would be to come up with to mandate a standardized approach, like it or not, that at least allows people to compare what's the social and environmental footprint of company A versus company B versus company C. For us, it'd be even better still if the UN got involved, because it'd be dreadful to have a different one in each market. But I think the role of government in this regard is to introduce standard measurability. And that brings accountability.
And within the professions, I don't understand why the auditors don't do this.
Yeah, it's a good question. So they are very vocal in some of the initiatives to try and introduce measurability. The big firms are there. I think moving a system like that from the ground up, remember the auditors are part of the system, and I think you're probably right, probably needs a top-down approach. So the government say, we're going to do this in a year, we're going to consult with the auditing firms and some big companies and other civil society, NGOs, but they're kind of in the system. It's hard to change the system from within it.
And what about, Alan, just specifically on the environment and on 2030 versus 2050?
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about what your agenda is and what you require, not just of people within the company, but the companies that you partner with?
Yes. Oh boy. We've got so much going on in that space, it's hard to come up with what's the most iconic example. For water, waste, carbon, social impact, we've set goals that we have no idea how we're going to achieve. So we've said we want to be a carbon neutral company by 2030. We said we want to be 100% green electricity by 2020. We've achieved that a year early. By the way, that cost us something, but we think it's initially that cost is worth bearing. We have made a recent declaration on plastic. So we've said, being completely candid, we use about 700,000 tons of plastic a year. We've said that by 2025, which by the way is tomorrow, we'll use an absolute 100,000 tons less plastic, that 50%, bless you, that 50% of the remainder will come from recycled material, and that we will gather up and collect at least as much plastic as we use, so that we will try to introduce circularity. Be good to get into discussion on this, by the way. Plastic's a fantastic material. Anyone who's switching from plastic to glass is destroying the environment, he says provocatively, hopefully. Plastic's a wonderful material. The problem is it belongs in the economy and not in the environment. So what our whole mindset is to try and deal with plastic in a way that stays in the economy. And then maybe just one other example, which is we believe in a concept of a fair living wage. Last month, about 3 years ago, we had several thousand people working in Unilever's supply chain who were not making a fair living wage. The last 7 people were in Rwanda, and we couldn't figure out what a fair living wage was in Rwanda, but we've now done that, and we now believe that everyone in Unilever's employment is now making a fair living wage. And we're thinking, how do we extend these standards further back into our value chain and further forward?
So can I ask you about that? Because that is presumably where you really have the leverage, is if you said, look, we're 2030, and we'll only work with people who are 2030, that would...
Yes.
And what are the obstacles to doing that?
Not too many. Willpower.
Willpower.
So I think going forward in telling our customers what they'll pay their employees is quite difficult. Yeah. Insisting, we have something called a responsible supplier code. We've now audited, if I remember, about 25,000 suppliers. And if they don't meet certain standards on environmental, how they treat their how they treat their employees, quality, safety.
But you've not got a net zero requirement on the other.
Not yet, but watch this space.
Can I ask you honestly, are there companies that say, look, and that's fine, right? But we're an energy business, and you can't impose on us a set of standards that, frankly, are much easier for Unilever to meet than they are if you're a miner or a natural resources company.
Yeah, some do. Some choose to say this is too high a standard. We can't work with you. But most realize that unless you're moving in a direction of addressing your social and environmental footprint, you will become irrelevant. It's enlightened self-interest.
Right. So there's a gentleman over there.
I'm Brown, and I'm the chairman of a family company that's listed called Redefine. It's still Jack Daniels, so I'm fifth generation chairman. So it does depend on how big the family is, by the way, how you nurture that DNA. But can I just say, look, I don't think there's much of a debate for a company like Unilever doing all of these good things, in part because it's an incumbent, 150 billion market cap, and the investor support is there because of the long-standing nature of the business and the incumbency of those brands in a growing global economy, and of course the management professionalism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's so many good reasons why the investor base in London would be behind Unilever as it takes these stands, and because of its size, it's able to, in a way, have its cake and eat it too, vis-a-vis the investor. By contrast, in the US this past summer, the Business Roundtable came out with this vision of stakeholder capitalism. It made loads of headlines. What didn't make the headlines was the response from the Council of Institutional Investors. Those are the people that run the pension funds of the first responders, the policemen, the firemen, etc. And they told those well-meaning business people, like our CEO today, to forget it. That actually you were failing to be accountable to your investors if you were to sign up to stakeholder capitalism. And so I'll come back to one of the early cynics in agreement and say, that businesses, and my company and I are in this situation, don't enjoy the risks of being of first mover disadvantage, and that it's much easier on us if governments, God forbid even multilateral agreements, give us an even playing field so that we're not punished by investors for sticking our head above the parapet. And if you're a family business and you do that, then what good is the world if you go out of business having stuck your head over the parapet?
Please, can I ask a question? It's so interesting.
Yeah.
What are you fearful of? What is the negative consequence that you're fearful of? Is it like adding cost or losing what's?
Yeah, look, in our case, margins are being, actually this is complicated. I shouldn't give you too much detail. I'm fearful of the hard seltzer trend in the United States right now, but the
hard seltzer trend?
Sorry, that's a competitive threat. That's another topic.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. The definition of putting your head above the parapet is in effect eroding your own margin and therefore eroding your equity values, the value of your equity, and actually by eroding the margin having less money to give out as dividend. And so you can quickly head into a downward spiral if you invest more capital, which ruins ROIC, and you compress margins at the same time. And now your share price comes off, you underperform major indices, all of which are way up these days, by the way, because of negative interest rates. So we're living in a bizarre world where this sort of thinking, and that we aspire to as well, and we get human rights awards and environmental awards and all the rest of it, and I've got wind energy now in Kansas, etc. Even though we live near one of the largest coal strains, in the OECD, Kentucky. So I've lost my.
No, but Garvin, just finish up. No, but the fundamental fear is that
eroding returns.
You're going to end up failing to deliver on dividends and failing to deliver for shareholders.
I do think corporates, inshallah, have been given a pass as of late because of negative interest rates
and of inflated equity prices.
Inflated equity values, multiples are up for everyone. And so we're all able to be more cavalier than we would be otherwise. Let's see how we do in 2010 on these topics.
Okay, well, I massively appreciate it. I think it feels like a dose of sort of C-suite reality. I'm come to you, madam, then these two gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Flea Shepherd.
Flea, did you say?
Flea, or Flea. It's Welsh, it's difficult.
That's a whole other thinking.
Fear with an L. Fear.
Yeah, I worked for Tesco for years. I was very proud to join their corporate affairs graduate scheme straight out of university. And part of what attracted me was a few years before that, 2008, 2009, Terry Leahy at the time launched a big 2050 zero carbon drive, and that was for all scopes. That was scopes 1, 2 and 3.
Yep.
So a life cycle of a product through how it's produced, the energy used to produce it, through to how a consumer uses it, and Unilever would have been one of the big sort of 20 companies that was part of that big drive. Then a few years after that, because that wasn't resonating with consumers, because as crazy as it sounds, back in 2005, 2006,
nobody cared.
And it wasn't resonating with colleagues outside of our kind of head office world in Hertfordshire. People in store didn't really understand the impact that they could have. So rightly at the time, in some ways, people decided to focus on other forms of purpose, and there was a big push on food waste, and Tesco and lots of other retailers have done brilliant things on driving down food waste and helping with food poverty in the UK by partnering with relevant companies like the Trussell Trust. And as much as I still am very proud of Tesco, it kind of lost a lot of credibility with me at the time as someone who believed.
Because you felt it had sort of narrowed it sort of played close to home.
Even though the objective of being zero carbon by 2050 still exists, it'll still be in the CSR reports, it told everybody in the organisation that something that we said was really important isn't important anymore, and even though you've still got to work on it, it's not really, it doesn't have to inform your decision making in the same way.
Is there a broader lesson there, Phil, in the idea that the risk of purpose is that it's faddish?
Yeah, and because these issues are really difficult and they're hard to grapple with, and they're never really going to be finished.
Yeah.
And so when do you legitimately decide, right, that purpose is exhausted, I've done everything I can do, and therefore move on to a new goal? Or do you sometimes, I think sometimes you should be going, no, it might not be the latest sort of flavour of the month, but it's important to
stay the course.
Yeah.
Alan, do you want to just talk about, I suppose, a mix of what Craig was talking about and Garvin and Phil too, which is about the short-termism of your sort of delivery deadlines and the long-term nature of the problems?
Yeah, I think I feel like a failure right now because I'm passionately believe there is no contradiction between short-term operating performance and addressing long-term issues. And I'm trying to persuade the group that that's the case, but it keeps coming back, no one believes it.
Oh, hang on, let's just find out. Is that true? Who here believes that those things are compatible, short-term delivery and long-term goals? Who here thinks it's not compatible? Who here doesn't know? Okay, fine.
Okay.
Go on.
I absolutely love Jack Daniels, and if I knew that it was coming from, sustainably sourced barrels, I'd love it even more. So go for it, please. I think, Fleur, I can give you a good example of one we've struggled with. We are trying to look at it, when we say by 2030 we'll be carbon neutral in our operations, that's within sight. We can see how to do that. We have debated full end-to-end carbon neutrality, which means that from the very, very germination of the agricultural raw material to the last disposal of the product, we would be carbon neutral, and we can't get there. And the reason we can't get there, well, we can't get there alone, is the single biggest carbon footprint that Unilever has is the energy that's used to heat the water for people to wash their hair, wash their body, and wash their clothes and cook their food. And that carbon impact is so massive that anything we do in our operations is trivial by contrast. And so the only solution is grid change. So as the grid moves to renewable sources, then we can contemplate end-to-end imaginability. It kind of comes back to, are there some things business shouldn't do? So if we'll agitate for change to the grid, but actually I think it would stop us from doing some very valuable things within our own operations if all we did was preoccupy about the biggest impact area, which is grid electricity.
Should you pay for that change to the grid? If Unilever is a corporate beneficiary of the heating of that water, is there a mechanism that you've thought about that is the way in which you pay for that?
Someone mentioned pricing and externalities. Yeah. The world needs carbon pricing. Let's be in no doubt. If we don't build carbon pricing one way or another, then we will continue down the path of warming up our environment.
This gentleman here, we're starting clustered. Come here, sir.
For many years ago.
Been a while.
I think what's interesting about the short-term versus long-term is I remember meeting Paolo Barilla, the current man who runs Barilla, and he showed me out his window a train line he built, and he said to me, if you look at that train line, it would never pay back, but it will pay back for my grandchildren. And that is a vision that I think is very, very hard to deliver in the sort of, in the tussle of everyday kind of deliverables. But I think for me, the really interesting thing, Alan, you talked about was this difference between what you say and what you do. And I think one of the challenges for brands and businesses is the split between bravery, because actually consumers aren't ready for a lot of the things we need them to do, whether it's embracing environmentalism, whether it's tackling inequality. And I think actually the challenge for businesses is how brave are they prepared to be, because I don't think we have the time that we need to sort of, I think, run this stuff slowly. So I think you are always going to be ahead of the curve in terms of investing and pushing people to do things.
Interesting. So this gentleman here.
I want to pick up on...
what's your name, sorry?
Nick Allen, sorry. I worked in the energy sector for 15 years. Chunk of work around sustainability, some of it with Unilever. Your point about cost of carbon, so you're right, in converting the energy system, you have to price the cost of carbon to drive the innovation. I want to pick up something. For me, I think the biggest issue is that needs to be regulated, but governments do not have the civil society and public legitimacy to do that. And so the point about
Sorry, Nick.
So-
If governments don't have the legitimacy, who does?
To say we're going to put the price on home energy of decarbonisation, that lands up on the front page of the Daily Mail. Your prices are going up.
Yes.
And so you get a public reaction to that. So the public, us, have got to accept that there is a price for this change.
Yeah.
I can see it happen.
I see what you
In
mean.
some areas you don't need it, but things like energy,
Right.
and the pace at which we need to transform the energy system now is frightening.
Yep.
It is possibly achievable, but it will cost. And I do not think investors will not risk the money in those investments without some indication that it will be priced in. And that means it prices to Alan and Alan prices it to his customers.
Yep. Yeah.
For me, that's one of the biggest issues we've got. 10 years ago, it would have been possible, it's coming out the back of Copenhagen. I think our political system has gone back in 10 years.
Yeah, but COP26 is going to be in Glasgow.
We're going to get it sorted out.
We're going to sort it out. I don't want to trivialise the point. It is, we're at danger of straying into politics here. But someone's going to have to pay for carbon, and ultimately it is the consumer.
Yeah.
And like all things, those who can afford it best should pay the most, and there needs to be, people on government support shouldn't be bearing it.
Well, perhaps Rex Tillerson could give away some of his $40 million that he earned before he went into government as CEO of ExxonMobil.
Possibly.
Yeah. I do. So,
Sorry,
what's your name?
Sorry, Ben.
Ben.
I just wanted to pick up on a few points that have been made. Firstly, I absolutely do believe that the credibility comes from results and measurable results across all of this stuff. And more importantly, the areas that businesses choose to get involved in. I think there has to be, and there is, a conversational shift away from just doing no harm, so away from just cleaning up your supply chain and paying people a wage, but businesses actually stepping into the governance gap where governments have been losing credibility. One of the things we talk a lot about where I work is about businesses being human. So from the CEOs to the employees to the customers to the shareholders. And so businesses, because of the enormous clout, leverage and voice that they have within society, have not only a potential but a responsibility to stand up for human issues, so human rights issues. So not just environmentalism if you're a big polluter, but also actively advocating for human rights within the society and communities.
But can I just take that? I'm going to come to you in 1 second. But take an example of Hong Kong, right? This is a really, really good question, I think, for someone who runs a business, which is, you've obviously got a huge market in China, and you've got a set of principles around individual human rights. What do you do?
What do we do about what?
What do you do about weighing in in Hong Kong? How do you articulate a point of view on that?
We would absolutely not weigh in on something like Hong Kong. That's party politics, and you began with an opening hypothesis that there are some spaces that business doesn't have legitimacy to go into. I think that's the type of area where it would be inappropriate for us to step in. However, I'll give you a good example. Most of our brands have got a don't test on animals policy. Mm-hmm. The Chinese government, one of the ways they've built protectionism is, I don't know if you know this, but if you manufacture cosmetics in China, you don't have to test on animals.
Right.
If you take the exact same formulation, but import it, you do have to test on animals. And it's pure protectionism. Hold on.
Yeah.
So we are taking the hit and not selling those products in China because we won't compromise on animal testing. And if, for example, there was a requirement that you did certain things with your workers that was in opposition with our values, we find it very easy to say no thanks, then we'll not participate in that. But getting it somehow or other becoming political advocates for Hong Kong, that's beyond our scope, I think.
Okay. Man, there's a question here and there's a lady behind. Yeah.
This is definitely coming from the more cynical.
So what's your name?
Kate Shoesmith.
Kate.
It's definitely coming from the more cynical end of the spectrum, but it does feel like there is a certain irony in it. The companies who are really driving the purpose-led conversation are often the companies who are spending huge amounts of money selling us products that we don't necessarily need. Disposable coffee cups, hugely energy consumptive data centres through our mobile phones, cosmetics, those sorts of products. Is that something that we surely be something that we should be aware of in this conversation.
So your point, Kate, is just simply that the rising expectation of consumption is at odds with this. That even if profit and purpose are compatible, consumerism and climate are not.
You know, I was going to, who made the point about jumpers? You said, I think one of the businesses I admire the most is Patagonia. And their founder, Yvon Chouinard, read his book. It's called Let Your People Go Surfing, and it is breathtaking. I'm conscious of time, but he discontinued 60% of his product range, pitons, because he reckoned they were damaging the very rock that he loved, and reinvented the business. They're now saying, don't buy a new jumper. If you go into a Patagonia store, look at the responsible sourcing that's going on. It's absolutely fantastic. Recycled cashmere, turning plastic PET into fleeces. And that circularity is, I think, the ultimate solution to consumerism. And there will be, we could all go back to scratching around in caves, but I quite like having a shower with a nice bar of soap in the morning. But you have to ask yourself about, how much do you want to consume?
Yes, there's a lady at the back. I said so. Yes, you.
Laura Round used to be a special advisor at DFID. Firstly, I'd say I'm quite optimistic because I think you can't define prosperity without sustainability. Slightly cynical because I think greed is, short term, probably interfering with that. One of the main focuses that my boss Penny Morden had was to leader in the private sector in reaching the global goals in 2030. And I just wanted to highlight a study that we did, and the results have since come in that might be of interest, which is looking how people want their money to be invested. And there's some very positive results, especially for millennials. However, profit and returns is consistently the number one. So how you then combine those, I think, is what's been discussed today, but I just wanted to...
Interesting.
There's a gentleman here. Unfortunately, the flag gone up, so I've got these two. This gentleman's going to take his arm out of his socket. So I'm going to have this to you, and you so, yeah.
My name's Ben. I'm from the Unmistakable. I think a lot of brands and advertisers actually give purpose a bad name. I think some people are doing some fantastic work, but I think a lot of them, from experience working with them as well, actually mean meaningful promotion, and then they get bored of it and they move on. And I think that what we need to be is not people that launch campaigns, but actual true campaigners, people that believe and want to actually make a change long term and don't just drop it just because the brand score hasn't shifted in 6 months, which it never will.
So your point is that once a brand commits to it's the 15-year point. You've got to stay there for a long time.
It can't just be like trendy. You've got to really believe it, bring people on board that mean it, and keep going with it, even if it's not giving you headlines every day.
Right. So
I've got there just in time.
Just in time.
Obviously, we've been talking about big business for a good reason. I run a small business, and I think it's really interesting the point around incumbent and looking at these massive corporates and what they're doing on a massive scale. I think for small businesses, this is all really stressful. I think this whole idea of mission and purpose, great if you've got one, fantastic. But this whole idea that you have to have your mission on your homepage, on the front of your website, is very stressful. And I think it leads, for obvious reasons, to problems. And James, you mentioned the WeWork example. People see that having a mission potentially gets you over the first kind of 10 hurdles to your first billion. That I think it can be, as a small business, very stressful, particularly if you don't necessarily have an obvious mission.
So I want to pick up on that on a final point, even smaller than the small business, and come back to you, Anna, with one thing. We're going into a general election. One of the things that's amazing about our politics is I suspect we will see quite a high turnout next Thursday, but we're probably seeing a gradual weakening of people's relationship with political parties. Their passions are not dulling, but their affiliation to political parties is. But we are seeing, whether it's in a small organisation or a small business, and individually, a much, much greater engagement with activism. And as someone who's on the receiving end of activism, I was really interested, just to finish up, Alan, by asking, when you think about purpose and the relationship between that and protest and activism, what's the kind of activism that actually works? What's the kind of thing that makes for change?
I'm going to duck your question a little bit because I don't feel we're on the receiving end of activism. I think we're on the dishing out end of activism. I really, really do. Ben and Jerry's and Seventh Generation closed their offices and went and protested in the climate protest. Ben & Jerry's is campaigning right now for fair treatment around cannabis legalization, where a lot of already rich white dudes are getting richer on the back of legalized cannabis, and a lot of black dudes are still locked up in jail for things that are no longer a crime. In fact, we even talk about every brand and activist in the business, and more we find ourselves heavily aligned with Greenpeace, with people for the ethical treatments of animals. And if Greta Thunberg was in this room, I would congratulate her and applaud her. I worry for her, but we want to be corporate activists.
Interesting. All right. Well, listen, on that optimistic note, I'm going to end. If you've been to a ThinkIn before, you know that it operates like a news meeting, at the end of which the editor, happily me, you'll see that I really do make the rules up here, happily me, gets to try and say, look, where do we think this takes us? Because the idea is that our ThinkIns then inform the journalism that we do. And I suppose I'd come away with, if you like, sort of two structural and one sort of specific thought. I think that there's a really interesting thing that we very, very quickly get into, not, I think, a mismatch between profit and purpose, but between investment incentives and public outcomes. And the fact that, whether it's Garvin worrying about the fear on what the expectations are from shareholders, or Rebecca's point about the way in which the markets work, or Maureen's point just about sort of the way in which people think about money and financial return, I think that there is actually really exciting opportunity for people to start talking about how do we do what Sam's saying, how do we make sure that we measure social outcomes and that they become part of the performance of not just executives but companies overall. I think there's something actually just worth noting about how worried we are about public companies and this idea that we'd love to see a family company. That's an amazing change of itself, because for a long time people thought of family companies as something that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of people who were born into it, had not earned it. And it says something about our concerns about short-termism in the public markets, that attitude has changed, and that there is, there's a sort of sympathy for the idea of a different employee-owned family business that Craig mentioned. I do think this point that you made, Alan, about you get what you inspect does raise an issue, which is, at the moment, the impression you get is that as a consumer, it's really hard to measure what companies are doing. And if you're a company, you can't get over how many different people are you measuring you in different ways. And there needs to be some organization of that. And so I think if there's a solid sort of simple idea, which is let's standardize metrics and let's standardize measurement, particularly around environmental outcomes, that would be incredibly helpful. I do think there's a massive gap for the auditors here, and that seems one thing. So that's the sort of financial infrastructure. I'm really struck by the fact that there is a certain amount that simply purpose-driven businesses cannot do, and that government has to do. And I think Nick's point about we're 10 years late on pricing, but we're going to have to do it and do it now is clearly an important one. And your point about, well, we can see that the biggest area of energy use is around restructuring the grid, is a really important one. And again, only governments are going to do that. You can agitate for it, but you can't deliver it. And I thought the distinction between Hong Kong and guns was really interesting. There's certain things that only governments can do to speak, if you like, in the public interest, and there are certain things that companies and individuals can do. And I thought that was really interesting distinction, because it's not as though both aren't highly controversial, but some areas are, if you like, constitutional. In fact, in that case, both, but some areas feel like they can be social. But I suppose the thing that I come away with, which is specific, is I loved your point about willpower. That actually one of the things that's the most powerful here is just your determination to do things. And I was really struck by, it's not just the fact that you're a 2030 company rather than a 2050 one, but the potential of what you might do in cascading that through from a sort of corporate ambition to a brand's ambition to a potential partner's ambition. And I did take, Bruce, your point that these things don't just have public outcomes, they do sort of test or set a new requirement of morality for the people working in it. But it really strikes me things like that will have a colossal reverberation. The second thing is I was really, really struck under the category of willpower by this clarity of purpose. Actually being able to say climate and inequality, these are the things, make actually life a lot simpler for people trying to understand what a business does. And so I actually think that, if I may, I'm going to find a fence and sit on it. There is a really great spirit in this room, which is overwhelmingly to be encouraging and embracing the idea of purpose-driven businesses with a large amount of ginger in the mix. And I hope that that's the way we'll go into 2020, thinking that there is a different expectation of business and that expectation keeps rising. Personally, I just wanted to say it is a great thing to be able to get this kind of time to sit and listen to you. One of the things I've often found difficult as a business reporter is actually getting the time to listen to all the different pressures and the different ways that people running biggest businesses in the world actually think. So on behalf of all of us, I want to say a huge thank you to you, but I also want to say a huge thank you to everyone else who got up early in the morning to try and think through this problem. I really, really appreciate it. If you're not a member of Tortoise, join up, and if you are, come again. Huge thank you to Alan Jope.